Hello, everybody. Welcome to another video. Today is the 4th of April, and today we will begin by looking at a positional advance in Zaporozhye. But the main focus of this video will be on Toretsk and Chasiv Yar, including a new portion of the front line that the Russians have recently activated and have been able to, accrue some new territory and towns in. It's been a part of the front line that hasn't really moved for about a year now, and now we're actually seeing some momentum and some changes that could have broader implications for the Donetsk region. So we're going to look at the way in which Toretsk and Chasiv Yar interact. We'll look at some Ukrainian troop movements that have been reported on. There's still not really mainstream reporting, but I do want to shine a light on it about potential Ukrainian troop transfers to Chasiv Yar and about generally the orders of battle in Toretsk and Chasiv Yar over the past couple of months. We'll also look at Russian advances across the perimeter of Toretsk that have been able to nearly take back the entirety of the city over the past 2 weeks. And then we will conclude the video. So let's begin by zooming in on Zaporozhye. You can see over here just a slight positional advance by the Russian side, amounting to 0.8 square kilometers of territory south of Kamyanka. This indicates that there still is a Russian presence over here and that they may be looking at first squeezing out the Ukrainian small squads that are operating in this salient. It's an area that's exclusively consisting of open fields. There are a couple of tree lines and dugouts as well. Ukrainian squads from the 128th Mountain Assault Brigade are likely the ones resisting over here, trying to divert Russian attention away from the larger target being the settlement itself. But once the Russians are able to squeeze out the Ukrainian formations from here, they will have a solid base along both the eastern and southern flanks of Kamyanka to begin a two-pronged attack. And that is probably the local Russian objective in this region in order to remove any Ukrainian forward threat that could be posed by operating in this town, because it is relatively large in relation to nearby villages. It also acts as a staging point. It's not necessarily in high elevation, but just to the north of it, there are a couple of hills that overlook the entire valley running into Vasilivka, which acts as a local Russian coordination point. And so this would be a way to just generally upgrade the front line for the Russians, push it a couple of kilometers northwards across a pretty broad line from the west, spanning to the east about 20 kilometers. And we now know that based on these Russian recent advances, there's only one village left that the Ukrainians still retain control over. They recaptured during the 2023 counteroffensive, and that is Novoandrivka. All the other ones like Shcherbaki, Malay Shcherbaki, Stepove, Lobkove, Pyatikhatki have been taken back by Russian forces in recent weeks. But let's move on and focus on the interesting update from today, that being from an area that I refer to as the Sukha front, because there really isn't a singular settlement that can be dubbed the overarching target of this part of the front line. It is a peripheral region that hasn't really encountered a lot of fighting, a lot of movement, I should say, over the past year. Last time that it was rather interesting was during the Russian breakthrough. I believe it occurred in March of 2024 in the Ocheretina region, with the Russians capturing that town and then expanding further westwards along the rail line, which is located on a massive ridge. And that's eventually what allowed the Russian forces to cross over the Vavcha River and expand really, really deep throughout the summer of 2024 towards various cities like Selidove, Pokrovsk, etc. So that was really important. But directly north of Cheratina, despite the favorable positions captured by the Russian side, they were unable to capitalize on those advances, much of anything. They were able to, at most, advance another 4.6 kilometers northwards. But Ukrainian squads, Ukrainian brigades, not many of them, a tight knit grouping, was able to hold the front line and still is up to this day at an area that consists of Kalinove, Hnativka, and Stara Mykolaievka. Part of that is because of the Russian attention shifting away to loftier gains, areas that they consider to be more important. Part of it is due to the Ukrainians over here utilizing a dense array of defenses and the terrain generally being difficult over here. There are not many roads, a lot of ponds, swampy areas, uh, ditches, weird assortments of fields with just varying elevations, making it very uncomfortable for even troops on foot to advance, let alone in armored column, which is what the Russians did use in many cases to advance westwards along the rail line, or they use company-sized formations, or not company, but elements of companies, small squads from those companies to advance along the windbreaks, and those windbreaks obviously gave them concealment. The same thing cannot really be said for the area a bit to the north of Chiratina. So that's why the Russians were really not focusing on advancing over here. But over the past couple of months, I've noticed the vulnerabilities over here. This region is important because it acts as a glue between the obviously front line that currently is unfolding around Toretsk, and to west, the situation that is around Mirhorod and Pokrovsk. And this is an area that's really been exposed to less of those sort of violent engagements. But in order to move from one place to another, you should have to pass through. You have to pass through the highway over here, marked in yellow, that connects to Konstantinivka, which acts as a really important conduit between the rear in Donetsk, which would be in western Donetsk, and then various parts of the front line like Toretsk and Chasiv Yar. So Konstantinivka is really important for the Ukrainian side. A lot of artillery brigades are operating around there. A lot of armored vehicles have recently been moved there as well, and they're being dispersed between various parts of the front lines according to Ukraine's needs. And then you also have various trench lines that are built to defend the perimeter of the highway in order to ensure that it can remain a steady supply for the Ukrainian side, despite the fact that there are currently clashes going on very close to the highway in one specific region that is located to the northwest of Vozhvizhenka. And the Ukrainians, understanding the importance of retaining control of the highway, were able to push the Russians out of it in a series of localized counterattacks. And so they deployed a large grouping over here, including the 1st Tank Brigade. And there were a couple of other units generally floating around here, like 14th National Guard Brigade, 111th Luhansk Territorial Defense Brigade, and 157th Mechanized Brigade. And so something that I noted early on is that there was an opportunity for the Russians to exploit a gap in the Ukrainian lines located north of Zelenopola. You can see I'm marking it over here in red with this perimeter. It's an area that's exclusively open fields besides Alexander Pil. I'm marking that over here for you guys. And it's on a massive ridge. This ridge overlooks the highway, of course, which would be really disadvantageous for the Ukrainians as their eastern flank would be really exposed and consistently fired upon. And same thing for the entire trench line, which is really well built. You can see that over here because there are multiple layers, anti-tank ditches, dragon's teeth, layers of trenches and dugouts that are fortified, connected together, really with the intention of dragging out any clashes over here for a very long period of time. It would really require a lot of attrition to take it over. But if the Russians were able to establish solid positions overlooking them, then they could gradually attrit the Ukrainian forces themselves over here. And there's really an open question as to whether there even are a lot of Ukrainian forces in these regions, because right now there isn't an expectation of there being fighting over here. So there's not much of a Ukrainian commitment to defending in this rear location just yet. But of course, I've just proposed this. I'm not seeing really any indications of the Russians going forward with my proposal, but it just seems like something that would be logical to do based on the frontline dynamics and the fact that recently the Russians have beefed up their grouping that is located in this circle over here. But so far, the only fighting they've engaged in is a bit to the west, with arrows sort of going in this direction towards the highway directly, not necessarily going to its east. But that's something that could change. And that was my sort of assumption going in, that the Russians would try to do it to a certain degree, because then it would undermine the rear of the general grouping involved in this area that I'm circling with the cursor, and that could sort of be paired in tandem with attacks that are going on in Toretsk to sort of create a cauldron, not fully encircle it, but to squeeze out Ukrainian forces and make it more difficult for them to move in and out. And we are seeing the Russians push into this cauldron. We're definitely seeing that, but just not from the direction that I've been looking at keenly. There is a notable Ukrainian grouping over here. It's not large, but it includes elements of the 93rd Assault Brigade, which I find to be pretty interesting because they're also committed to other areas, including Toretsk and also Shevchenko. Not Shevchenko, but parts of the Pokrovsk front, just north of Pischane, as you can see over here. I mentioned that in one of my earlier videos. So they have at least a couple of battalions over there. You also have at least one battalion of the Separate Presidential Brigade. As a whole, the unit operates around here, but it is split up across numerous parts of the front line, including Luhansk, Toretsk, and Chasiv Yar. But the headquarters is over here. You also have at least one battalion of the 104th TDF Brigade. You have the 109th TDF Brigade as well. And then, yeah, it's a drone unit as well. So there were a couple of units of note over here, and they've been tasked with just holding onto the line. What I did not expect was to see the Russians pushing directly through populated areas to flank some of the holdings from the east, because this is an area that the Ukrainians have been able to constantly project control over, really without much of a challenge. And now I'm going to change the marking of Alexandropol to be fully red because the Russians have taken it over in its entirety. They were able to capture over the past 24 hours 5.6 square kilometers of territory, advancing along this open road, this paved route, taking over a local stronghold built by the Ukrainians, and also cutting off the local highway moving up northwards. Really important highway. As you keep following it, you eventually connect to the highway that is dubbed T0504, which passes through Konstantinivka and then from there reaches Chasiv Yar. So the Russians have been able to achieve advances really in the lion's dens, so to say, in an area that is very dense when it comes to minefields and fortifications. And it also gives the Russians the positions needed to attack towards Valentinivka and Sukhabalka. These are some of the most important populated areas that the Ukrainians still retain control over nearby. And then from there, they would have a solid base of operations, including with settlements and basements, to push westwards and begin chipping away at all of the fortified locations over here and villages like Kalinova, as we said before. And this would be a huge step in taking control over a buffer area that the Ukrainians have been able to really retain control over at a low cost to them, both when it comes to troop commitment and casualties. And from there, the front line would really begin to shift in significant ways by further unifying the connection between Toretsk in general and the area east of Pokrovsk. It would put a lot of pressure onto Konstantinivka from the south in the long term. So that's something that really has implications for the latter portions or maybe the mid portions of 2025, because right now those sort of large scale movements have barely even started. And to chip away at such a tough nut to crack, it takes an extended period of time, depending on the circumstances. So as we zoom in on Toretsk, this is a really vital part of Russia's broader planning for this region. So you can see over here that the Ukrainians were able to stymie the Russian objectives with Toretsk for about 2 months. The Russians were hoping to capture the entirety of Toretsk because they were able to do it in pretty quick succession, started taking over most of it. And then from there, they were hoping to use the sort of excess or surplus resources that had available after some troop rotations as well to attack westwards towards various other villages running along the Toretsk River, and then from there eventually reach southern Konstantinivka. But the Ukrainians were aware of this reality, and they were aware of the fact that they would have no permanent bases of any sort of significant quantity, significant size besides Konstantinivka itself to defend in for their large garrison besides Toretsk itself. So they decided to counterattack. And for 2 months, they were able to fight back and forth, including in the Zabalka district, including around the entire perimeter of the city, and were able to infiltrate pretty deeply, put the Russians on the defensive, and thereby deny the Russians their own offensive endeavors. But now the Russians have been able to almost completely reverse the gains achieved by the Ukrainians during that time period. And they've done so over the last fortnight in really significant degrees. So you can see over here that in the southwestern portion of Zabalka, including this mini portion of the district, you have a Russian advance amounting to zero point 0.7 square kilometers. There are a couple of videos backing this up. So a lot of this is coming from the 12th Azov Brigade, but also from the 100th Mechanized Brigade. They are hitting individual Russian motorcyclists that have taken over the houses and are now trying to push westwards and take over all the routes and all the paths that the Ukrainians tend to use in this region that is in between the rail line and Toretsk. Here you also have the Donetsk group hitting a Russian motorcyclist west of Zabalka. So there were a couple of examples to back it up and indicated the Russians have taken over this agricultural area as well. There's still a bit of ambiguity about the western portion of Zabalka. It could be under Russian control, but I'm going to err on the side of caution for the time being. There is a video here. I don't remember the date, but it is recent. It's from the Black Hawk unit of the 100th Mechanized Brigade. they hit again a Russian motorcyclist. There are many of these being utilized over here. You're not seeing heavy equipment. Really haven't seen it since the late portion of 2024 when it pertains to the Toretsk region or even the New York area. But you do see still private vehicles and motorcycles. So they're the ones that are achieving these deeper penetrations. They pushed probably from northern Zabalka to the road over here, Vilutsilia, Skachova, and this is an indication of a really deep advance by the Russian side, amounting to 1.2 square kilometers. So the Russians have taken over much of the Terracan over here, giving them elevation advantage if they can use it to their needs, if that's safe at all, because it is so close to the front line. I'm not sure about that. But once the entirety of Zabalka is taken over, it will obviously be used as a firing point, an advantage point to overlook Sochi nearby and also Novospaska. Besides that, you also have geolocations released by over the past couple of weeks from this same Ukrainian garrison of other areas, residential areas on the periphery of the town of Toretsk that were taken back, and that all plays a role in how I've structured this front line, meaning that the Ukrainians right now have this narrow corridor which extends out of Sochi and includes some trenches, some forested areas, and some open fields, and then an even narrower portion that act as the conduit to Zabalka. But besides that, the entirety of the Toretsk region has been taken back. That includes areas in the northern part of the city where the Russians took back zero point 0.6 square kilometers. This includes houses and open fields connecting them to the deepest Russian advance that occurred on March 18th, where they were able to nearly reach some of the local ponds and dachas. And then in Krimska was taken over in its entirety by the Russian side, including all of the residential areas. So what's next for the Russians over here is really the cleaning up phase. They will have to ensure they, first of all, solidify control over the perimeter so the Ukrainians cannot conduct any additional counterattacks. But they also need to remove any sort of outstretched pockets that the Ukrainians have that are acting as defensive resistance points. Because without taking them over, the Russians will not be able to effectively push deeper and achieve their objective of advancing along the Kryvyi River to arrive at the southern entrance to Konstantinivka. So for the time being, that includes taking over areas like this one over here, including Dakhnia and nearby dachas. It includes sort of taking over these open fields and terracons circled in red over here. It includes obviously taking over whatever remains of Zabalka and then shifting focus to taking over the nearby villages where there still is a significant Ukrainian presence. And so that's definitely going to require a lot of efforts. And then from there will be a more solid line for the Russians to use as a base to advance northwards. But that's still really far away. There still is a lot of work to be done by the Russian garrison over here, which is now sort of being led by the not this unit, but by the 103rd Motor Rifle Regiment and generally by the 150th Division, and they're the ones that are doing a lot of the heavy lifting over here. And that all is supposed to connect to Chasiv Yar because the goal would be for there to be a two-pronged attack eventually, one from the south towards Konstantinivka, and then, of course, one coming from the east. That cannot happen, of course, if either of the two cities are not fully captured first. And so while the Russians were sort of put on the back foot in Toretsk for 2 months, the same thing isn't really true about Chasiv Yar because in Chasiv Yar, it's more complicated. There was much more of a stalemate between both sides. And now based on the situation, the Ukrainians are able to continue resisting, but their stature and the way in which they are positioned is extremely difficult. It's manageable, but it is rather unfavorable for the Ukrainian side. And I'll explain why. Imagine trying to move in supplies, resources from Konstantinivka, having to cross through relatively open areas and then rural villages. So definitely areas that the Russians could strike at will, and then you have to move through this very narrow corridor. It amounts to 2.5 kilometers through areas that really lack roads in many cases. If you're not using the actual district of Chasiv Yar, if you're going from the forest to the north, there are basically no roads over there. And that's the direct way to access the current region that the Ukrainians are focusing the most attention on to defend. So you can understand why the logistics situation over here is very complicated, but nonetheless, the Ukrainian garrison is strong over here, and that's why they've been able to resist. They have a whole host of defensive structures at their will that have withstood a lot of Russian intense bombardment from Fab strikes included, just because of the sheer quantity and strength, resilience of these structures and their basements. Even a large quantity of Fabs have not been able to cause significant damage to these structures, and their skeletons are still standing. And so that helps the Ukrainians defend over here despite the difficult logistics situation. And so, in terms of frontal advances, there are none. There are only minor advances that have occurred a bit to the west over here. But having this sort of northern flank that helps isolate the center of Chasiv Yar is a part of why it's going to be difficult for the Ukrainians to continue defending over here. I'm not saying they can, but it's just very difficult. And so, there have been talks of Ukrainians regrouping, building up new formations in Chasiv Yar, sending in units that were located along other parts of the front line, and now they're organizing around Kramatorsk, and they will be sent to Chasiv Yar. So there is a possibility of a Ukrainian counterattack in the near future. I'm not saying it's a certainty, but it would seem logical after what happened in Toretsk that we see something similar around here, at least with the area to the northwest of the core of Chasiv Yar, because this area is the most threatening. It could also include the core of Chasiv Yar, including, the refractory plant and a couple of other houses. But that's a bit less important because the Ukrainians already have a solid base of defense in the core and in the urban citadel. It's more so to do with the flanks that are just very threatening to Ukraine's logistics situation. So there have been talks of 3 brigades being sent to the front line over here in Chasiv Yar, new units. I don't know what the time frame is though for these reports. So it could be that they were already deployed over here, because there are a couple of units that were recently shuffled around and have a presence in Chasiv Yar. So, for instance, the 112th Kiev Territorial Defense Brigade, previously, as like late as January, February, I had them marked in Kupiansk and also fighting on the Oska River bridgehead. I had them marked there very clearly, and it appears at some point during March they were moved to this location, and they are now engaged in the defensive activities over here. Same thing with 5th Assault Brigade. They previously were located over here, but they were moved, at least in parts, to defend in the Pokrovsk region. They fulfilled their task, and now they're back, at least partially, in Chasiv Yar yet again. And so those are important reinforcements for the Ukrainian side. Besides that, I really don't know which units could be mentioned. So maybe they're ones that just have no connection at all, had no connection at all previously to Chasiv Yar, and are now being deployed for the first time as reinforcements, either to strengthen defense or for those sort of localized counterattacks like we saw in Toretsk. But besides that, what we know publicly is that the current garrison consists of 24th Mechanized Brigade, this being the main unit involved in a lot of defense, 56th Brigade as well. There's also the 18th Slavic National Guard Brigade. And that's about it when it comes to brigades. There are a couple of drone units and battalion sized elements as well. And that's generally it. It's the 1 year anniversary of the Battle of Chasiv Yar starting, by the way, because about a year ago, the Russians entered into the Kalinina micro district a bit to the east. And you can see how the maximum advance over a year has been, what is this, 6 kilometers? So 6 kilometers at most in a year. This really goes to show how good of a defensive linchpin Chasiv Yar is, and it remains one, by the way. Even though the Ukrainians no longer control the canal and the ridges and trenches that accompany it, they don't control most of the forests or the 5 mines south of Chasiv Yar. They don't control the refractory plant or a lot of apartment buildings. Even with all that being said, they still control a significant amount of structures and ridges that allow them to continue resisting against the Russian side. And so that really plays a big role in why they've been able to drag out this fighting, and they hope to do so in the future, because the longer they defend over here, the more they can build up defenses in between Chasiv Yar and Konstantinivka. And just before we end the video, I do want to move up northwards over here and look at just a slight advance by the Russian side south of Kamyanka. Now the Russians have officially entered into the village, and so I'll mark it in black to indicate that it is in a gray zone. The Russians advanced 0.8 square kilometers. This video from April 4th from the Phoenix drone units shows that there were drone strikes on numerous Russian vehicles that were advancing from positions like Topoli and Liman Druhi and crossing over the river near the Kamyanka region, and they were struck by that drone crew. But then the video also pans to Kamyanka itself and shows that some of the houses over here were struck, which gives us an indication that the Russians have finally entered in. Their goal is to take it over in its entirety, this being the final village that is located adjacent to the Oska River, not under Russian control, as opposed to the exception of Zaporozhye, which is also a nearby hamlet, which has to be taken over by the Russian side. But imagine the loss of Kamyanka would be significant because then there would be no accompanying village or position that the Ukrainians could fall back to besides Bolohivka and Vorichanske, and those are so far away. So basically, everything in between would become an area that the Russians could usurp, seize control over, and then from there push further westwards towards a line that is more stable for the Ukrainians. And their rear over here could be exposed. We don't know the strength or the gumption of the Ukrainian garrison over here or how strong the rear is because it has not been tested yet. But this could be a potential fallback line at some point. And so that's all for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.